For over 50 years, GPS XBN has been elected and entrusted to govern Sarawak. Yet, with abundant natural resources, our small population of about 2.8 million people are living in the poorest state in Malaysia since 1963. With the coming election to choose the next Sarawak state government, it is time for all Sarawakians to review how GPS XBN in government had performed or failed to perform over the last 11 terms in office. In this case, the situation and status of our state economy. In 2019, Sarawak's GDP was 149.7 billion ringgit. Meanwhile, Selangor has a total of 357.8 billion ringgit. Comparatively, Sarawak's GDP was only less than 10% of the Singapore GDP at 374.4 billion US dollars, which was achieved without any natural resources like oil and gas. The average household income for a whole family for Sarawak is only 5,218 ringgit per month, compared to the average household income of 8,210 ringgit per month for Selangor, a state which does not even have oil and gas. With an average household size of 4 persons per household, the average individual income for Sarawak is about 1,304 ringgit per month, compared with the national figure of about 4,390 ringgit. For those Sarawakians earning below the average wage, they know very well how difficult their living is as they struggle to make ends meet day in and day out. For the last 50 years, the rural peoples of Sarawak are still deprived of basic good roads and bridges to connect their longhouses or villages, lack of stable electricity supply and clean piped water, lack of proper schools, decent housing, healthcare and internet connection. In terms of the poverty rate, Sarawak is much higher than the national figure. There are at least 87,740 families in Sarawak living below the PLI. Imagine about 90,000 households of Sarawakians are living below poverty line and finding great difficulties in buying enough foods, clothing, access to electricity, water, transport, schooling and medical care, let alone enough to pay for housing or car loan. Among the 28 poorest districts in Malaysia, 13 are in Sarawak. Another 7 are in Kelantan, 5 in Sabah, 2 in Kedah, and 1 in Pahang. There are still many rural natives depending on jungle and river producers. Most of the customary land area are not commercially developed and without proper and timely land titles. There is no meaningful scheme or assistance from GPS to help the native landowners to develop their own land commercially by themselves. Limited access to markets and to other basic services is common in the interior parts of Sarawak. The problem of remoteness has meant that a majority of our rural areas are lagging behind in terms of development and infrastructure provision, which in turn affect the livelihood strategies adopted by the rural communities. Instead of spending a lot of state resources on grand projects like the Second Trunk Road, which is very much like a duplicate of the Pan-Borneo Highway, better road and river transport systems within the rural areas will increase the accessibility to markets and services, which is fundamental to raising the standard of living. Many of the rural peoples have lost their jobs after the decline in timber production, but GPS did not offer any relief or living assistance to them in spite of huge timber revenue collected over the last 50 years. In fact, many of the rural population are suffering financially and become vulnerable to the short-term monetary temptation offered by GPS, using the people's money once every 5 years to vote for them, so that they can continue to govern Sarawak with broken promises and more surrendering of our rights to the federal government. The GPS in government has been using the people's money to get the support of the community bodies and the people in each constituency using the MRP and RTP monies selectively, only for those who support or agree with GPS or its practices. All the government monies are public monies belonging to all the people of Sarawak and not just to the supporter of GPS. Sarawak not only have a big portion of its rural population living in poverty, but a big number of our urban population are also living in poverty. It simply does not make sense when Sarawak, having the highest amount of natural gas and oil resources and abundant land and water opportunities, yet there are so many poor people. It is simply unfair that under GPS XBN government that the rich resources and sea territories were surrendered to the federal government for the progress in West Malaysia, while Sarawak remains a poor state. Sarawak accounts for half of the country's natural gas reserves and possesses around 30% of its known 5.85 billion barrels of oil reserves. The state BN, now GPS government, without the approval of the Dewan Undangan Negeri DUN, surrendered the rights of Sarawak's oil and gas and 75% of its sea territory to the federal government through the enactment of the Petroleum Development Act in 1974. Just the revenue for oil and gas itself, Sarawak is losing some 41 billion ringgit per year. The loss of revenue from oil and gas will be about 14,600 ringgit per Sarawakian per year. Since becoming Chief Minister in 2017, Abang Johari has been committing major reckless development projects one after another. In the 2019 and 2020 budgets, Abang Johari had committed a total of 45 billion ringgit of lavish mega projects, mostly initiated by himself. Since Abang Johari became Chief Minister in 2017, he has been fervently setting erratic policies with erroneous objectives. There are a lot of talks about Sarawak being given more participation in oil and gas industries in exchange for foregoing the return of our rights on oil and gas resources. However, again, there is a serious lack of transparency as to how these things are being settled. Until the 1970s, Malaysia was predominantly an exporter of rubber and tin. The country managed to overcome the colonial heritage that shaped its economic structure based on primary commodity dependency and developed to become an exporter of manufactured goods. However, Sarawak's economy remains being driven by export of primary commodities until today. With abundant natural resources and vast land mass, and after 60 years of independence, Sarawak should be among the front-runners in our economic achievements. Unfortunately, after nearly 60 years of the same government under BN and now renamed as GPS, Sarawak is ranking behind among its neighbours and peers. In particular, for the benefits of the majority Dayak people, the government should have a plan to allow the rural population to own land for agricultural development such as oil palm, timber and other crops, and promote such agricultural plantation estates and help them to develop their land, but the GPS government has no such initiatives. After nearly 60 years of the GPS ex-BN government, Sarawak only managed to save and achieve a reserve of 31 billion ringgit in 2019. By comparison, Maybank has a fund of 33.2 billion ringgit in 2019, consisting of retained profits of 27.1 billion ringgit and reserves of 6.1 billion ringgit. The larger the state's reserve, the stronger and more independent Sarawak will be. Otherwise, the state will depend on the mercy of the federal government in everything Sarawak can or cannot do. With the annual expenditure of 10 billion ringgit, it is prudent that Sarawak State Reserve should be increased to 100 billion ringgit. Yet since becoming Chief Minister in 2017, Abang Johari has rigorously been committing major reckless development projects one after another, and if the spending or committing of these development are continued followed with more run-before-walk mega projects haphazardly and imprudently, the state will stretch beyond its financial limit and capacity. In the end, the state will deplete its reserve and may face financial distress. GPS has failed to control the COVID-19 pandemic spread in the state. Sarawak has among the highest new cases with more and more emerging clusters and hundreds of new cases every day. GPS has also failed to respond quickly to the current massive collapse in commercial activity and economic output triggered by the pandemic. There is no immediate substantial recovery policy. This will result in severe economic, social and financial setbacks, aggravated further by GPS impending reckless spending on redundant mega projects. A recession will occur if faltering demand, restricted supply and lost income reach critical levels. Obviously, GPS is in a conundrum and does not have the ability to take urgent and radical actions to solve the impending economic crisis. Sadly, it has been 58 years. We have had enough. We cannot allow this mistake to be prolonged. Under the Chief Ministership of Abang Johari, the status and affairs of the Sarawak economy are not getting better, with the people living under distressful poor conditions, seeing no improvement and no future hope. For our next generations and for our beloved Sarawak, we must speak out.